right. Good morning, and welcome to Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church. We have a lot going on in the church this morning. In addition to our normal Adult Education Hour and Social Justice Forum, there's simultaneously an information session happening across the hall in Westminster Hall regarding Tim's announcement of his retirement. So as I believe you've all heard by now, Tim has announced that after his long tenure of service, he will be retiring at the end of October. And so there's an information session going on right now, which is a chance for folks to ask questions about next steps and the process. But I am grateful that you all are here with us, and those who are online, welcome. Glad to have you with us as well. We are in the middle of a series called The Ties That Bind. It's a series about the question of family and family relationships as a metaphor for how we understand what the church is. Where did that metaphor come from? What are the gifts of that metaphor? What are the costs of that metaphor? And we're exploring that through a number of themes throughout the spring. So Matt and I introduced the theme back in April, and then last week, there was a beautiful session with Tim Delmont on notions of Christian fatherhood and his own experience of single fatherhood and how we understand that sort of within the context of the church. We'll also hear later on this spring from Amy Marga, professor at Luther Seminary, who's going to come and talk about notions of Christian motherhood. Mothering in the Christian tradition is I believe, her title. And we'll hear from Jimmy Hoke about queer contributions to Christian theology of relationship. So we did set this up in a somewhat binary way, but we're also hoping to kind of explode that binary and look at other ways of being in relationship and being in community. And in fact, that's the topic for today. So as Matt and I were talking about this and saying, we don't want to privilege any one form of human relationship or way of connecting. And so we wanted to talk about non-romantic relationships and the importance of non-romantic relationships to human flourishing generally, and then also within Christian theology. So our topic for today is friendship and community. And we'll take a little time on friendship at the beginning and then really switch to talking about community. So that's going to be our game plan for today. So I came in and I wrote this quote from C.S. Lewis on the board here. "Friendship is unnecessary. Like philosophy, like art, like the universe itself. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which give value to survival." And Matt saw this quote and he said, "Oh, good, are we going to fight about this?" And so, but I think this would actually be a good place to start, right? Is with this quote about friendship. Do we agree with this? With what Lewis is saying here? Or do we think that friendship does actually have survival value as well as giving value to survival? So I'm curious if you, when you first saw this quote, had thoughts or reactions or comments about it. And Matt can pass the mic around here. That was a mic drop very early in the presentation. Yeah, Jen.
Yeah, the first thing that popped up for me is, didn't we just disprove this with COVID?
Yeah, right. That there is legit survival value to friendship and human connection. Yeah, Nan, did you have a comment? And then Doris, go ahead.
Well, the first thing that came to mind for me was it the movie with Tom Hanks? Was it called Castaway? Was that it?
Oh, sure.
So he's on the desert island, and I'm thinking, so at first, like, no, you can survive. He was all by himself on this, like, with no water in it. But then I thought, oh, yeah, but he still needed community. He had his soccer ball.
Wilson!
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe one does.
Yeah. Yeah, Margie.
I kind of think of how loneliness, I work with the elderly, and how loneliness is such, it affects our very being and our health.
Yep.
And yet when you have friendship and kindness and compassion, that helps. So obviously we have to have that
Yeah.
in our lives.
No, absolutely. I think sort of at both ends of the aging spectrum, right? For the elderly, loneliness is a particular challenge, and then also for the very young. I mean, if you think about children who experienced their first or second year of life in that lockdown, in the midst of that isolation, and the things that they missed out on as well. Young people, teenagers, it's sort of across the board. I don't have PowerPoint slides today, so we're gonna do the old-fashioned way where I sort of hold up a printout. I might ask Matt to sort of run this around, but this came out just last week from the Surgeon General. It's called "Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation," from the Surgeon General, right? The same person warning us about the physical health effects of cigarettes. Here we go, holding that up for the folks at home. And it talks about, just as you all were saying, what are the negative side effects of loneliness, and they're substantial ones. There are effects. I mean, the risk of premature death from loneliness they identified here. It's the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? For people who are experiencing those intense levels of isolation, it causes increase in heart disease, in stroke, increased risk of dementia, increased risk of mental health issues, suicidality. There's so many things that are sort of concrete physical health risks that come from this place that we're in, and their diagnosis of our society as a whole was not sunny at this particular moment. They did, they listed sort of 6 streams of potential action, and the first one had to do with social institutions, right? Building up the social fabric. The decline of participation in religious institutions in particular was one of the sort of factors that they cited. So the thing that we are doing here in church, really, really does have an impact on people's health and well-being. Some of it is just showing up and being part of a community in a regular way. So we're gonna maybe thank C.S. Lewis for pointing out the ways in which friendship gives value to survival, but dispute him a little bit on whether or not it has survival value at all. So Matt, did you have any other comments about this this quote from the start of class?
I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I would imagine that even at that level, you could make a case for why some kind of reciprocal devotion
Sure.
To somebody else of your species.
Yeah, matters and makes a difference. Yeah, we are wired
not that I want
for.
to reduce theology to evolutionary biology.
Yeah,
but,
well, that could be a whole
they can
separate.
both be true.
That could be a whole unit, theology and evolutionary biology. So we'll start by talking about friendship, but we're not actually. We're gonna not linger too long over friendship, and part of the reason why is that mostly the relationships that are described in the Bible, there are primarily relationships of community, of groups of people being together, more so than sort of one-on-one connections between two people. But they're relationships that have real value. And I mean, can anybody name some sort of friendship pairings in the Bible? Anybody think of? Jonathan and David. Yep. Jesus and John, the beloved disciple. Yeah. Ruth and Naomi, yes. Thank you, Betty. Yes. No, I was hoping that you would name them as well. Yeah. This sort of mother-daughter-in-law relationship that really becomes this strong, effective bond. Yeah. Most of the sort of there is actually a robust philosophy of friendship. There are people who think deeply about the value of friendship and the nature of friendship. And I feel like we, in our current society, we don't talk about friendship very much. We're primarily talking about romantic relationships. The quizzes in the back of Cosmopolitan magazine are not about your relationship to your friend. They're about your relationship to your boyfriend, right? That's the real sort of value that we give to relationships. But there's a long history of interest in friendship and sort of theorizing of friendship. So we're going to start, and I'll take the mic for a second, because I'm going to go to the whiteboard. So there's 2 figures I'd like us to talk about here. So we're gonna go first to the classical tradition. and talk about Aristotle, whose name you can't see, so I'm going to choose a different marker. And Aristotle had this classification of 3 different kinds of friendship. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about 3 different kinds of friendship. And I just want to lift this up because I find this to be a really useful frame for thinking about relationships. So there are friendships of pleasure. You enjoy the other person, you enjoy spending time together, it's always fun to be around them. That's one category of friendship. Another are friendships of utility. So friendships that confer some kind of advantage. You know, think of you go to a networking event or something like that, right? This is a friendship that brings some kind of advantage, hopefully to both parties. You know, this is not a friendship of taking advantage of somebody else or using somebody else. And those friendships can also often be pleasurable in their own right. They can be, they can be, they're not just transactional. They can be relational as well. And then his third category is friendships of virtue, which is a friendship that arises out of a deep appreciation for the other person, for who they are in and of themselves, for their character, for their virtue is a word that Aristotle uses a lot. And that's, I mean, Aristotle is big on things that are ends in themselves, right? That's what his whole philosophy is sort of building towards. And so he would rank virtue friendships highest on this list. But he would not diminish the value of these other 2, right? This is all of this stuff is a net good. It's important to have not just those relationships with the best friend we've had from forever who calls us on all our stuff, who helps us be a better person, right? It's also important to have a network of people, you know, so that my neighbors shoveled my walk when I was away, you know, and I've shoveled theirs, right? That sort of being embedded in a community of mutual care. And then it's also important to have friendships of pleasure, right? The joy, happiness, those things are really important. So he does kind of rank them, but he doesn't diminish the value of numbers 1 and 2. So I'd like you to just take a minute at your tables and think through if you can think of somebody in your life now or in the past who sort of falls into one of these categories. When you hear these categories, is there a friend that pops into your mind, a particular person? Or maybe it's somebody who fills all 3. I had a work colleague in my first presbytery who was so fun to hang out with, was a real mentor to me, and somebody that I deeply admired as a pastor, right? So people can check all the boxes. We don't have to totally categorize. But I'd love for you to just take a moment at your tables and just discuss if there's somebody who comes to mind in any or all of these categories for you. So I'll just give you a minute or 2 to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and draw us back together. If you guys could wrap up, and I'm not sure if everybody's had a chance to share yet at your tables or not. I'm sorry to sort of keep us moving along. We're trying to cover friendship and community in the same day. I did want to say, and I meant to start out with this, but I will say it now. Matt has always been so helpful whenever we're hitting a topic that will have some kind of an emotional or a spiritual or a pastoral kind of tenderness to it. He'll say, we're sort of opening a can of worms here, right? People will bring their own lived experiences into the room. Especially this ties that bind series, right? Anytime you talk about family, it can activate a lot of things in people's hearts and minds and spirits that can sometimes come from a sort of painful place. And I know for myself, actually, as I was preparing for this one, this was the one that sort of activated for me my own sense of being in a new place, feeling no longer being proximate to friends who live in other places or communities that I've been in before. So I just want to sort of name that we are talking about a really kind of tender topic here, even though we're not talking about romantic or family relationships. This can hit those same places in our hearts and spirits. So I just wanted to sort of name and honor that. Anything that came out of your tables that you'd like to share? Any observations or themes that appeared? Was this a helpful kind of framework?
I was talking about a group of friends I have where I would say the primary thing we do for each other is support, and trying to figure out where that would fit, and not liking the word utility for that because it seems too utilitarian and
Yes.
not as
Yeah.
but it's like the group of friends where, like, last summer when I was in the hospital, like, that's who I texted to come and pick me up and take me back home again. It's like, sure, we have fun together. They're also fun people to be with, but mostly they're like my group where we all help each other out. If somebody's sick, we bring something to each other. Somebody needs something.
Yeah.
Somebody's sick. If I need somebody to drive me to an appointment or something, that's the group I would call.
Yes.
And wanting a better term.
Yes, that is a sort of dry philosophical term for something that's really, really important. Yeah, Betty, go ahead.
So specifically to pleasure, utility, and virtue, I look at that as a real intellectual exercise that is more adult in its approach, but that in both the experience that I had going through divorce, where all of a sudden friends started drifting away as they heard that we were going through divorce, and all of a sudden I went, where are they? And somebody said, you've got your heart friends, you've got your close friends, and then you've got your peripheral friends.
Yeah.
And that I found more helpful to my kids, to other young people that I've counseled,
Sure.
that to see it in a different view and recognize who are your peripheral friends who maybe you thought were close friends.
Sure.
Well, maybe not.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
Yep. No, that's very helpful. Yeah. Nan, go ahead.
I would say that finding friends over time is different. When you're little, you're in school, you have these automatic settings where you sort out and figure out who you want to play with on the playground or hang out with in college or something like that. But or even when you're working, but having retired, I find I have to be a lot more deliberate and conscious about cultivating or identifying and looking around, like, who do I want to invest in more? And so it's been a much more kind of a proactive activity to plant the seeds and nurture that a lot more, since I don't have these sort of other natural settings other than Westminster.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. There's one more? No? Okay. So thank you for this. I think there's a real sort of robust view of what friendship is and means. And Nan, I think you're right that what stage your life you're in when you make those friends can make a real difference. When you're a little kid, everybody's new, and you enter situations, you're playing together. It's pretty easy to enter into a space where social connections happen, and that really changes with adulthood. I remember one time I was on a flight that got stuck on the tarmac in Minneapolis here in January, and we were there 5 hours on the tarmac and then back, and they let us back into the place where we'd wait together, and we were going to put us on another plane. It was maybe a total of about 12 hours of waiting, and I was traveling alone, and I just got to the point where I didn't want to read. I didn't want to sort of go inward. I really wanted to connect socially with other people, but I didn't know, there's not, you can't just say to a grown-up, you want to play, do you want to, but I was so desperate. I don't know if I should tell you this story. I was so desperate that I was sitting at a table with other people. I just started to draw a little checkerboard on my notebook, and then I cut out little bits of paper to be, and I was sort of and somebody said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm making a checkers set." He's like, "Oh, it's on." So we actually started to play checkers together, this stranger and I in the airport. But then I learned why people don't make checker sets out of paper, because the minute I laughed, all the checkers board, so we were, but I find I have this sort of playful bent and sort of wish it were more socially acceptable for adults to kind of engage with each other the way that children do. Just one other little nugget I want to give on friendship. We won't discuss this, we'll just sort of move on. But the other, as I was doing some research on philosophies of friendship, the other one that sort of popped out was from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about the two main characteristics of friendship. And I think he's talking up here about, Betty, what you would call, was it heart friends? Are those, heart friends. And the two that he pulls out, and I just love this, are truth and tenderness. That good friends will tell you the truth. You're not sort of dissembling, you're not putting on airs in front of them, you're not trying to get them to like you all the time. That's already sort of settled in. But that they'll also do so with tenderness, with love. And I love the combination of those two words as characterizing that kind of deep heart friendship that you're talking about. So, but I do want us to move on from friendship to community, because really many of the relationships described in the Bible are relationships of community. So people who are relating to each other, to God, to a set of customs or practices, to living together in the same place. And so that's what we'll talk about today. I asked, it's nice to have a New Testament scholar as your colleague, because I asked Matt, where is there friendship language in the New Testament? He said there's a little bit in the book of Acts, that section at the end of Acts chapter 2, where they talk about the disciples being together and having things together in common. And there's language in there about the alignment of their hearts. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. This sort of characterization of a kind of relationship that's akin to a kind of friendship language for talking about relationship. But we don't have a lot of sort of theorizing in the New Testament about how one person relates to another as a sort of chosen friend, right? The letters that we have are letters from an individual to a community, or letters from an individual to another individual who's a leader in the community. They're about sort of how the group relates to each other as a whole. So for the second part of this class, we're going to shift to talking about community. And I'd love to hear, can you think of examples of community in the Bible? We talked about examples of friendship. What are examples of community in Scripture? Early church. Yep, absolutely. The disciples, this little band. Yeah. think of the covenant relationship that God has, right? It starts out as a relationship with a family, with Abraham's family and Sarah's family, and then moving down through Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and his 2 to 4 wives, but then with Moses and the covenant that happens at Sinai, that becomes a covenant with the community as a whole. It becomes a covenant with lives in being at the present time, and the entire community, not you and your offspring, are singled out, right? This becomes God giving the people kind of a way of living together, and so we see just again, and even when the prophets are calling out injustice, calling out social wrongs, that's much more often directed to the community as a whole rather than singling out one individual. A lot of that judgment language that we hear in the prophets has to do with how we live our life together. And so we see community all over the place. And I wanted to share a little bit just from the civil rights trip that I went on, the civil rights learning experience that we had it was not last week, but the week before, to Alabama. We went to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, toured various places where the civil rights movement took place in the 50s and 60s, went to museums and memorials to learn about this history, but also got to talk to individuals who'd been participants and eyewitnesses to the movement during that time. And one of the things that struck me again and again is, the history that I've been taught has a lot to do with the sort of names of famous individuals, right? We hear about Rosa Parks, we hear about Dr. King, we hear about Malcolm X, we hear the names of the individual. I mean, that's the Americanization of the civil rights movement right there, is to come up with a list of sort of individual heroes. But the story that I heard during this learning experience really was about communities, going to the block where Dr. King's parsonage was and learning about all the people who lived on that block and the depth of the relationships there. That was really the thing that incubated this movement and made it possible. And hearing that again and again in every city that we went to, every person that we talked to, kind of what that role was. So it's not just sort of a matter of how God works in the Bible, right? It's how the Spirit continues to work, and not just being through individuals, but through communities. I've got an exercise for us to do together at our tables. I'm going to give you passages about community to read and discuss together and then report back to the group. And for those of you who are online, I'm going to post a link to the chat. And Matt, I'm going to ask if you don't mind passing out some papers. So for the 2 tables at the front of the room, if you could give those guys the blue papers. I think that should be some Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And then the table back there with Marie and Cindy and Justin and the Floyds could maybe get one of the green sets. And then the 2 white sets, if those could be for the 2 back tables. And you guys have different themes, different sources and different themes at your tables. I want us to look at the question of community and solitude. That's from Bonhoeffer. Community and choice from Rachel Held Evans. And then community and class is the social network piece that you guys have in the back. And for those on the chat, I'm going to post that for you now. All right, I'm going to go ahead and bring us back together in just another minute. I'll let you guys finish your thoughts. We'll take another minute and then come back together. All right. Okay, so I'll give a little bit of context about the passages that that each group had to read and talk about. So if you were lucky enough to be sitting at one of the front tables, you were reading some Dietrich Bonhoeffer from Life Together. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor and professor. He is probably most famous for his death. He was executed in a concentration camp in 1945 in Nazi Germany for his alleged involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler. He was arrested and then killed in, I believe it was April, so it was very much toward the end of the war. And part of his life was involved during the rise of Nazi Germany in finding ways of resistance, and especially ways of resistance among Christian communities. At a certain point, he was asked to lead a seminary, an underground clandestine seminary for those who were training to be pastors in the tradition that was not cooperating with Nazi Germany. And so the passage that you guys had was from his book Life Together, which is his reflections on that experience of community. So probably an experience of community that felt very intense, very much a community under siege, under threat, a community driven by a particular kind of mission. So that's the context for what you guys had, and in a minute I'll ask you to report out on that. At this table back here, they had a piece from a book called Searching for Sunday by Rachel Held Evans. Very different author, very different context and book. That is an author who emerged from a very evangelical context that she found particularly restrictive with respect especially to gender roles, but a number of other things, who then migrated towards a more sort of progressive and open theology, and also toward a more highly liturgical practice, toward a more sort of Episcopal tradition, a way of worshiping. And she really found an audience among especially women, but young people of all genders who had a similar kind of experience and still wanted to find a place within the faith and a place of community, but experienced real difference from their community of origin. And then in the back, you guys had something quite different. It was an article of a social network analysis of Jesus and his relationships. So who was Jesus in community with, right? And actually, Matt, I think I've got some extra copies of that. If you want to just put one on the other tables, they can at least see it, because I think it's an interesting thing to take a look at. And that's, who was Jesus relating to? Were those relationships positive or negative? And how were the people that he was relating to each other? So taking this very sort of modern way of looking at a community and mapping that back. So let's start, though, with the Bonhoeffer. So the tables at the front, one of the big questions that came out of that was the relationship between solitude and community, between time together and time alone. I'm curious to hear your reactions, positive, negative, your thoughts about this passage and what it sort of evoked for you.
I think that
I give you the microphone.
one statement that says it all is you cannot escape from yourself. Period.
Yeah.
I would just say that he took this to the extreme, that if you go all the way one way in solitude, you live in an abyss, and if you go all the way into community, you live into a void. But basically what he's saying is that as Christians, you can't just live in solitude, and you can't use community for your own purposes. That both are significant as Christians to have the time. You need the solitude to have the time to talk with God.
Yeah.
And you need the community. You need to be a part of the community and be a contributing member of a community to be in the Christian life. That's kind of my interpretation.
Yeah, that real sort of balance of both things. Yeah, any thoughts from this table on Bonhoeffer?
I'm going to respond to what you just said because it clicked something in me, and that is that I think there's also a great chance to be in the middle but not actually be invested in either. So you're kind of in community and lonely.
Yeah.
So
Yes. Being around other people doesn't necessarily mean actually being in relationship or actually being in community. Yeah.
would you share what you shared about your early church?
We were in a church when we were first married that was very dynamic in this way, in that the inward-outward journey, we talked about it, that if you aren't out serving someplace, you're dying, and if you're not nurturing your inner soul, you're dying. And so the way that worked in terms of our actual day-to-day life was we always had a Bible study, and we were committed to studying that alone at home to be then shared. And then we were always in the community somewhere doing some service together. And that made a huge difference. It wasn't that each of us went to our own little thing. And that deepened this. And it gave for me the experience of the flow of this. It's not either or. They fed each other. And then there was a much more dynamic thing going on there.
I will just add that situation. Everyone in the church was in a small group, which was also a mission group, together on mission. Groups were anywhere from 8 to 10, so that we were doing that in a small community, both inward and outward.
Yeah. That there was a community within a community. That there was. No, I think that's important. There's this thing called Dunbar's number, which is this theory of how many like actual relationships can a person sustain at the same time, and it puts it at about 150, right? Which is way smaller than where we are at Westminster, for example, or many of the numbers of relationships that we have in our lives. But that's about the size that everybody in a group can at least know who the other people in the group are. And so when you have a much larger place like this, there need to be communities within it that people can really develop that connection with. There's a different thing from going into a sanctuary with 1,000 people in it versus a small sanctuary, just in terms of what the space and the size of the group does to your own experience of community. Yeah. Let's see. Let's move to this table. You guys were the only ones with the green, with the Rachel Held Evans. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that passage.
Right behind. Oh, yeah. I'm lurking.
That's great. Well, it's a story about her sharing about a Lutheran pastor, a person that came out of a conservative or evangelical or fundamentalist background and became a Lutheran. And she wanted to be rebaptized. And her mentor, who's Lutheran, said, no, you can't get rebaptized because your first baptism was valid and it was meaningful. And you come from a family, and now you're entering into a new family, and you can't get rid of your family. So she struggles with, what does it mean to have a past Christian experience very different from where she's currently at? And she makes a few comments. I was baptized by my father. I paused and thought, did her dad actually baptize her? I was baptized by my mother. Oh, she didn't mean she was baptized, but she meant she was baptized. By Pastor George, by my Sunday school teachers, my sister, a used car salesman, who used to sing a gospel version of the old rugged cross, by a boy who put boogers in my hair, a little girl in a wheelchair who couldn't speak. This is what hit me. I was baptized by Alabama, by Reaganomics, by evangelicalism, by George Wallace, by Billy Graham, by Martin Luther King. And then this is the one that disturbed me the most. I was baptized by the sort of people who sometimes love me the wrong way.
Yeah.
So you wonder, it seems to me, same with Bonhoeffer, who's anti-Jewish, and never really comes to that issue because he didn't live long enough to really understand what that actually meant in his life. and you have this community that's harmful in some ways but healthy.
Yeah.
Every community, I think, has both an aspect where you need to let it aside and say, no, that's not where I'm at. That was unhealthy.
Yeah.
And yes, that's very healthy. And so there's a messiness, and she allows that or wants to enter into that messiness of what does it mean to be in community.
Yeah.
And it's a process, a journey, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, I think that is a really beautiful way of saying that, of naming that, you know, we can talk about all the ways that community helps us, but community can also harm us. And I feel like she really names both aspects of her point of origin and her upbringing. And I think the danger comes when you say that any community is going to be your salvation, you know, that really it's a community in the church is not God. You know, the church is in relationship to God, but the church is not God. And that's, I feel like she pulls together that tension kind of beautifully and well. Anything else from that table? All right, thanks, Paul, for that summary. Okay, what about the tables in the back? Now, this was different. This was the Jesus social network analysis. She basically took this sort of modern tool of mapping a social network and mapped it onto the Gospels to say, who was Jesus relating to, interacting with? Where were those relationships positive? Where were they negative? And then how were those people interacting with each other? Now, this is not a snapshot of social life in the ancient Mediterranean, right? Because this is as the Gospels tell it. So she's very much embedded within the story of the Gospels. But I'm curious about your responses to this, what you saw from this, or what limits this had as a tool. What did you notice about how, yeah. If we can get that mic, yeah.
I'm sorry, my group was looking at me because I was a little bit of a counter-narrative here.
Great, yeah.
Let me put it in a way that I think encapsulates what we were all talking about. It's interesting that in this diagram, the relationship between Jesus' family and followers and civil and religious authorities was somewhat positive. There's a lot of gray lines there and not too many red lines. So, you know, that seems to reflect that there's something, at least those who had become part of Jesus' community felt value in civil and religious authority. In this diagram, however, Jesus' attitude toward them is almost totally negative. So there's something weird going on here.
Interesting.
And I was actually arguing that Jesus' attitude towards civil and religious authority was not nearly as negative as being presented here. So,
okay,
but
so
that's a whole other.
You would have more gray lines, more positive lines between Jesus and the civil and religious authorities.
I would, yes.
Okay.
In particular, the Roman Empire, at least up until the point he got crucified by them. But
that is fascinating. Let's spin that conversation out further. But I'd love to hear other comments about this diagram, what you saw. Yeah.
Here's the alternative hypothesis.
Right. Yes.
is that the negativity or positivity of the relationship is not dependent only on Jesus. That is also dependent on the attitude of those with whom he relates.
Right.
And so the negative relationships could be more the reflection of the civil and religious authorities than those of Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, many of the negative relationships stem from the civil and religious authorities as perceived by the writers of the New Testament.
Sure. So it takes two to tango, right? This is not a diagram of Jesus's attitudes towards everybody. It's a diagram of the character of the relationships between them, which is there's a mutuality there. It's going to go both ways. And if you have people trying to trick or trap Jesus or crucify Jesus, those are some of the more negative aspects of that. Yeah, that's an interesting reading of this. Other thoughts here?
we just talked about the volume of lines between Jesus and all the groups, and then the volume of lines between the other groups. So it speaks to her, a kind of paragraph on the other side that says people stick to themselves in their own groups. And then we also talked about how we probably wouldn't have as many different groups in our own social network. But then we also talked about how it would be hard for us to identify stigmatized groups because, I mean, I think I have some people who would consider themselves in stigmatized groups in my friends and family.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not as maybe clear cut today.
It's not a sort of neat line. There's I think the word would be intersectionality. You know, you can have some areas of privilege and some areas of stigma at the same time. I'm seeing my 4-minute mark here. I also really appreciate just the attention, not just to the quality of relationships, but the quantity of relationship, and pointing out that Jesus does seem to be relating to people, especially in that sort of stigmatized and marginalized category, with just much more volume than they're relating to any of the other groups. You know, even, you know, I think it's another interesting exercise to say, where do you locate yourself in this diagram, you know? So when I look at this diagram and locate myself in the civil and religious authorities category, I think, oof, okay, this is, you know, there was a pastor who led a service learning trip that I went on a while back who just said, you know, I always take a pause when I look at how religious authorities respond to Jesus. I think that's always something worth people who are in positions of leadership in the church to be taken a look at, because that is some of the most tense relationships are there, and I can see why. Anytime you're exercising some kind of power, there's a potential for a distortion in relationship, but just the quantity of relationships that he has versus the quantity of relationships that the people in religious authority have with people who are on the margins, and even the disciples. You know, the disciples are not going towards people on the outside nearly as much as Jesus is. That is his sort of primary direction of movement throughout the gospel. So I think this. You know, I think this diagram has limits for sure, but I find it a helpful exercise in thinking, like, what if we were to map our own experience of our own networks, or Westminster's network, or our whatever communities we're involved in? If we were to map them in this way, what would we encounter and what would we experience? I just like this as a tool for bringing things forward. We have only a minute or two left here, so any other closing comments or questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you for this discussion of friendship and community. We will be back next week. Jimmy Hoke will be here. He is a young adult in the West Connect group. He is also a professor of religious studies, and he will be talking about queer contributions to Christian theology of relationships. So we're going to keep on the ties that bind topic for 2 more weeks. Next week, we'll have Jimmy Hoke with us. Thank you very much.